Do you think that wars in the Middle Ages were won by the sword and courage alone? And what if I told you that the fate of an entire region could be decided by a single blacksmith, without forging a single blade? Today we will analyze a real historical gambit, where the hammer proved stronger than the sword, and a blueprint, stronger than an entire army. Our story begins in a valley that at first glance seemed quiet and unremarkable. But this was a deceptive impression. In an era when wealth was measured in land and the number of swords, this valley found another source of strength. Its gold was its reputation, and its army was its guilds of artisans. And the center of this ecosystem, its beating heart, was the blacksmith's guild. At the head of the guild stood a man known simply as the master. But he was more than just a craftsman. He was a self-taught engineer whose fame extended far beyond the valley. He saw metal not just as a material for nails and horseshoes, but as a key to controlling the forces of nature. He was a man of a new mold, standing on the threshold of the future. His influence was felt in everything. When a farmer came to him with a broken plow, he didn't just fix it. He improved the design, changing the angle of the plowshare, using stronger alloys. The Oakhaven plow became a brand, a tool that yielded a third more harvest than any other. People came from far and wide for these plows. When a carpenter built a new mill, the blacksmith didn't just forge a shaft for it. He designed a new system of gears that increased the rotation speed of the millstones. This mill ground grain faster and better, turning the valley into the breadbasket of the entire region. He built. He improved. He invented. He transformed his valley from a simple agrarian settlement into a technological center, a workshop of prosperity. Every project he undertook, every improved tool, strengthened the valley's economy and reputation. And he, like all its inhabitants, believed that this prosperity was their best defense. They were wrong. Prosperity without strength is not a shield, but a lure. In history, prosperity often goes hand in hand with danger. For the peaceful and wealthy valley, the threat came not in the form of drought or famine, but in the person of a man who saw in other success only his future spoils. How did one name cause an entire region to freeze in fear? The tranquility was shattered with the arrival of a trade caravan. The merchants brought not only goods, but also news that made their blood run cold. Their stories were not of a metaphorical iron wind, but of a very real threat. A neighboring ruler, Baron Wolfhart, known as the Iron Baron for his cruelty and his invincible heavy cavalry, had finished unifying the surrounding lands. His mercenaries were renowned for their efficiency, and his treasury was empty. Now his gaze, predatory and hungry, was fixed upon their valley. The news struck like a hammer on an anvil. Everyone understood, their prosperous but poorly defended land was the perfect target for the Baron. They had a militia, brave farmers and artisans. But what could 100 militiamen do against 500 professional horsemen in plate armor, trained to crush any defense? A direct confrontation would not be a battle, but a slaughter. Fear became tangible. It hung in the air, in unspoken phrases, in the way mothers held their children tighter. The valley's ruler summoned everyone to a council. There was talk of buying him off, but everyone knew the Baron's appetite was boundless. There was talk of fighting, but everyone understood it was suicide. And then, in a moment of collective despair, hundreds of eyes turned to one man. To the head of the blacksmith's guild. To the engineer. If anyone could work a miracle, it was he. They expected more than just swords from him. They expected a solution. Any solution. And the weight of this silent demand was heavier than any metal he had ever worked with. Facing imminent defeat, when traditional methods of defense were useless, one man decided to risk everything. But his wager was not the lives of soldiers, but the power of his intellect. How can an engineering blueprint stop an army, and what choice determined the future of an entire era? That night, the blacksmith faced a choice that confronted the entire late Middle Ages. He could follow the old path, the path of iron and blood. And he knew how to do it. He knew the secrets of layered forging, how to turn soft iron and hard steel into a deadly Damascus blade capable of piercing knightly armor. He could have armed the militia with weapons that kings would envy. But he also knew that their valley could only field 100 militiamen against the neighbor's 1,000 professional warriors. Technology could not change this cruel arithmetic. This was not a battle, but a slaughter lost before it began. And then his gaze fell not on the blanks for swords, but on the blueprints for a water wheel he was designing for a new sawmill on the mountain river. He looked at the sketches of levers, sluices, and gears. And in that moment, he understood. True strength lay not in the edge of a sword, but in the ability to command the forces of nature, the power of water and fire. The shadow of a new world had to be fought not with the weapons of the past, but with the technologies of the future. For the rest of the night, he worked like a man possessed. The hammer and forge were silent. The only sound in the smithy was the scratching of charcoal on a large scroll of parchment. He was not forging a weapon. He was creating one. But it was a weapon of a kind never seen before. When the first rays of sun touched the valley, he emerged into the square. His face was gaunt, but his eyes burned with the fire of brilliant insight. He headed for the ruler's house, and in his hand was not a sword, but a tightly rolled scroll. On that parchment, there were no calls to courage or diplomatic ploys. There was a detailed engineering plan. Blueprints for a system of sluice gates and a small but ingeniously designed dam on the river above the valley. A plan that would, in a matter of hours, turn the wide plain before the settlement, an ideal field for a heavy cavalry charge, into an impassable marsh. He was on his way to offer them his gambit. Not to sacrifice men in a hopeless fight, but to change the battlefield itself. Could this audacious plan, this command over water and earth, truly halt the inexorable advance of iron and steel? That was the question upon which everything depended. When a war council convenes, one expects to see maps with troop movements and polished steel on the table. But at this valley's council, there was not a single sword on the table. Instead, there lay a single sheet of parchment, destined to become their shield. A tense silence reigned in the council hall. The valley's ruler and the gray-bearded elders, whose faces were maps of years lived, looked at the head of the blacksmith's guild with desperate hope. The air was heavy with fear of the Iron Baron and his invincible cavalry. At that moment, the engineer unrolled his scroll on the large oak table. This was not a call to arms. It was a lecture on hydraulics and fortification. In a calm and steady voice, accustomed to explaining the properties of metal, he began his presentation. He did not speak of honor and courage. He spoke of mathematics. He clearly demonstrated why their militia was doomed in open battle against a professional army. It was a cold, sober analysis that left no room for illusions. And then he moved to the second part of his plan, and his voice gained a steely edge. He tapped the blueprint with his knuckle. The Baron is strong on flat ground, where his cavalry can build up speed. We will not fight him on his terms. We will change the battlefield. He explained the essence of his project, Fortress. The plan was audacious and brilliant in its simplicity, to use the valley's main artery, the mountain river, as a weapon. A system of sluice gates, controlled from the settlement, could at the right moment turn the approaches to the valley into a viscous swamp, neutralizing the enemy's main advantage. The best defense, he concluded, looking into the eyes of the elders, is not a counterattack, but an impenetrable shield. We will not shed blood in a hopeless offensive. We will force them to get bogged down in the mud until their morale is exhausted. We will save lives and not become aggressors like them. Silence fell. The elders exchanged glances. The plan was unprecedented. It required faith not in the strength of warriors, but in the intellect of an engineer. After a long silence, the valley's ruler nodded. "Proceed, master," he said. "Your forge, from this day forward, is the headquarters of our defense." The decision was made. That very day, the forge was transformed. The anvil and furnace remained its heart, but a nervous system of defense grew around them. Workbenches were covered with blueprints. The walls were hung with diagrams of mechanisms. People no longer came with orders, but with questions. Farmers, carpenters, masons, everyone came to the blacksmith, and he found a task for each of them. The forge ceased to be just a workshop. It became the nerve center of the resistance. They say fear paralyzes. But there is a force that surpasses fear. It is the focused labor of a community united by a common goal. For the people of the valley, the cure for terror was the ring of the hammer, the screech of the saw, and working shoulder to shoulder. From that day on, the valley transformed into a giant anthill, working according to a single plan. And at the center of this movement was the engineer. He didn't just forge parts, he taught and directed. His forge became an academy where knowledge of levers, pulleys, and material resistance was passed from the master to dozens of assistants. Project Fortress consisted of many small but vital tasks, each an engineering masterpiece. The gates became the first line of defense. Instead of the old, heavy bolts that 4 guards struggled to move, the blacksmith designed a complex system of counterweights and hidden beams. Now, one person could set the massive oak bars in motion by turning a large lever. In the event of a sudden assault, the gates could be sealed in seconds, becoming a monolithic barrier. The walls were old, and their masonry had weakened in many places. The engineer designed special metal ties. Under his guidance, masons drilled holes into the stones, and his apprentices forged hundreds of these braces, which, like sinews, bound the ancient masonry together, making it many times stronger. To protect the work crews from possible enemy fire, carpenters built mobile wooden shields according to his blueprints, heavy, ironclad structures on wheels, behind which repairs could be safely conducted. Water and light are the lifeblood of any besieged fortress. The old well with its rope was unreliable. The blacksmith designed and, with his assistants, forged a chain mechanism with buckets that could not break and ensured a continuous water supply. And to illuminate the walls at night, he created safe, wind-proof torch holders with metal reflectors that amplified the light and prevented the flames from being extinguished even in strong weather. But the main thing he was building was not a defense of stone and iron. He was building unity. The fear that had recently gripped the valley gave way to focused, hard work. People who had once known only their fields and workshops now toiled side by side. Farmers carried stones, carpenters worked with metal, and masons learned to install intricate mechanisms. And above it all stood the figure of the engineer. He was everywhere, checking blueprints, showing how to properly temper a brace, helping to install a counterweight. He did not lead from an office, he worked alongside everyone, and his unshakable faith in his plan, his diligence, and his calm confidence were infectious. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He had become a leader who united his people not with calls to battle, but with common, creative labor. The ring of his hammer became the anthem of their unbreakable will. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? History usually answers, a cataclysm occurs. But in this valley, the answer was physics. For the engineer's gambit, the ultimate test had begun. The dawn brought not the song of birds, but the clang of steel and the heavy tread of hundreds of men. The Iron Baron's forces appeared on the hills. This was not a chaotic horde, but a professional, well-equipped army. Their armor gleamed in the sun, and their siege engines, battering rams and mobile towers, moved with frightening coordination. They set up camp at the walls of the valley, confident of a quick and easy victory. The test of strength began. It was not like the battles described in the chronicles. It was an engineering standoff. The first to speak was a massive, ironclad battering ram. Its rhythmic, crushing blows against the main gates were calculated by the Baron to breach them within an hour. The impacts shook the ground, but the gates held. The genius of the engineer's design lay in the distribution of force. Each blow was not concentrated at a single point but was dissipated throughout the entire wall via a system of beams and internal supports. The gates groaned but held, converting the furious energy of the assault into a dull vibration. Next, siege ladders were placed against the walls. But here too, the attackers were met with a surprise. The defenders, completely safe behind fortified parapets and mobile shields, did not engage in hand-to-hand combat. They used long, forked poles, created from the engineer's blueprints. Working in coordinated groups, they simply pushed the ladders away from the walls. It was methodical, almost mechanical work, devoid of fury and fear. The night brought the Baron no advantage. He had planned to use the darkness for a surprise assault, but the valley's walls were brightly lit. The clever, wind-proof torch holders turned the fortress into an island of light in the midst of the night's darkness, making any stealthy approach impossible. Baron Wolfhart, an expert in breaking walls and crushing morale, was furious. He had encountered an opponent who did not play by the rules. The walls would not yield, and the defenders were almost invisible. His strength was getting bogged down in engineering solutions, just as his cavalry would have been bogged down in a marsh. Victory is often marked by a final glorious charge. But some victories are won in silence, through a quiet and stubborn refusal to break. This is the story of such a victory. Days passed. Short, furious attempts at assault were followed by long hours of weary waiting. The Baron's forces were exhausted and demoralized. They had come here to fight warriors, but instead found themselves at war with the very structure of the valley, with stones, wood, and iron organized by a brilliant will. They had come up against a system that refused to yield. What was most disconcerting for them was the behavior of the defenders. There were no furious sallies, no insulting shouts from the walls. There was only the methodical, coordinated work of repairing damage, replenishing supplies, and maintaining the defense. The valley responded to aggression not with counter-aggression, but with a quiet, unshakable persistence. The leader of the attackers realized he was losing. He could sacrifice hundreds of his men here, but this fortress seemed capable of withstanding a siege for months. He was losing time, resources, and, most importantly, his reputation. Further attempts were pointless. One morning, the people of the valley, taking their posts on the walls, saw something they had been afraid to believe. The enemy camp was empty. Smoke from extinguished campfires drifted lazily towards the sky. They were gone. There were no joyous shouts, no victory celebrations. The air filled with a deep, collective sigh of relief. People slowly emerged from their homes, touching the walls that had protected them, looking at the dents in the gates, scars left by the departed storm. They had endured. The engineer returned to his forge. The air here still smelled of coal and metal. He made no speeches and accepted no congratulations. He silently looked around his workshop, picked up a plowshare from a workbench that had been damaged during the siege, and placed it on the anvil. He took up his hammer once more. And the silence of the peaceful morning was broken by a familiar, rhythmic ringing. The sound not of a weapon, but of creation. The story concludes with a simple truth. He did not gain the glory of a warrior, nor was he immortalized in ballads of great battles. But he gained something greater, the silent gratitude of his people and the right to be called a hero who forged peace for them. His legacy is not in legends of the standoff, but in every ear of grain that grew in the field he protected, in every home whose safety he defended, and in every strike of the hammer that once again served life.